Today's gospel takes place at the Last Supper. For the last evening, Jesus was on earth, and he's trying to prepare his disciples and us for what's coming. His suffering, his passion, his death, and his resurrection. We could wonder, what did they really hear? What did they understand? Jesus says wonderfully reassuring words. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not let your hearts be troubled. But sometimes, and we all know this, those words are easier said than really taken into our hearts. Yet we need to hear the Lord's words to us in these times. Do not let your hearts be troubled. We're troubled about many things. So many of you are out of work. So many of you are trying to learn how through technology to help your children learn. You are worried about relatives and friends, maybe people in nursing homes, people in the hospital. We are filled with things to worry about. And we don't know where this is going, just as Thomas doesn't seem to understand what Jesus is telling him. One of the things that's, I think, hard for us to realize is there are so many things in our lives that we actually have no control over. And yet we kind of like to live with the illusion or delusion that we're in charge, that we can determine our own destiny. And then we come across times like we're living in right now, when we know that there's very little that we actually can control. And even to try to control some of the supposedly simple things of daily life are pretty difficult. There's very little that we can control. And yet our first reaction is usually to push back, to rebel in some ways, or to be angry at this situation, that this is happening to us. Probably what the invitation in some ways is to consent to it, to realize that we don't have that power, we don't have that control. It's in greater hands than ours. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Jesus is promising and preparing the disciples, all of us, for life with him. St. Paul tells us that nothing, absolutely nothing, can separate us from the love of God that comes to us in Jesus. The great Saint Teresa of Avila, towards the end of her life, and she lived with bad health all her life, she was, in a sense, persecuted by members of her own Carmelite community. She was suspect. Who is this woman at this time in history who is this inspiration to so many? And she wrote this: let nothing disturb you. Let nothing disturb you. We need to learn how to abandon ourselves into the mystery, into the hands of God's love. We will be all right. Maybe not in terms of our plan, but in terms of this mystery of death to new life that Jesus promises. Jesus also tells us that he and God are one. He who sees me, he says to Philip, sees the Father. Jesus is the human face of God for us. Think about these days. Who are the ones who, in a sense, present the human face of God to us? Healthcare workers, first responders, people in grocery stores, drugstores, driving buses, people who are going about still their daily life, but at great risk. And on this Mother's Day weekend, we could certainly look to the great examples of mothers and grandmothers who are signs of lives given to self-donation, self-sacrifice. We also, in and through them, see God's face. Jesus tells us he's going to bring us into God's house, and that we already can live in it when we live close to Jesus, when we live out of love and service. Think about your house. Is it anything like the house of God these days? I'm sure every family has had its bouts of cabin fever, bickering, impatience, harsh words, and yet the invitation is, in this hard time, can we live in the house of God? Live in the house of God, who is a God of love and joy, of generosity. And so in this Eucharist, let's pray that we too, during this hard time, can cast our cares upon the Lord, let nothing disturb us, and help create life in the house of God.